Hi everyone, and welcome to these biology lessons. So this is lesson 1, biology, hierarchy, and organelles. It's one of 3 lessons that we're going to be covering today. And by the time that we're done the 3rd lesson, you'll be halfway through the biology portion of the course. So I want to show you something here quickly, just in case, because we're all coming to this course with different levels of knowledge. If we go to the bottom here, this is the activity I'm going to have you do after you complete this presentation. So you're going to have to open up your glossary. I might as well just show you where that is. So if we go to content here, and we go to day 1, the first part where you found this lesson, biology day 1 glossary, you just download that there. So at the end of the activity, you will need to open up that glossary and fill out words from biological hierarchy up to cytoskeleton. That's going to be your homework, so to speak, at the end of this lesson. So to do that, you're going to have to go to this website here, which is just the link provided. And I have all the words here. And if you click on any of the words, it shows you where on the cell that is. So if we click animal cell, you can kind of see where things are. There's nucleus, there's the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and so on. You click on it, and it tells you a bit about it. So that's going to let you fill in the glossary in your own words. So the reason I'm telling you this right now is because I'm going to be going over some things with you in this PowerPoint that assume you have some knowledge of this stuff. They assume that you know what a nucleus is, you know what a cell membrane is, you maybe have some idea what endoplasmic reticulum are. So if you don't know what these things are, I suggest you do the lesson in reverse. Do this glossary first and then come back. If you do know what those things are, then just follow along. We're going to begin. Okay, so where I'm going to start here is I want to talk about these pictures because these pictures are typically used to talk about the parts of cells and what they do. And they're useful, but they're kind of bad because there are misconceptions that can come about from these pictures. And I know it's kind of silly because that's pretty similar to the pictures I've given you on this website. But as I said, they are useful. But there is something kind of bad about them, and I want to address that right now. So to do that, I'm going to talk about something here. So what I'm going to talk about is this is a space probe that was sent out in the 1970s. It's called Pioneer 11. Took this shot of Jupiter, which was amazing for the time, and is now the 3rd farthest human-made thing in space. So it's hurtling out of the solar system. So the reason I bring this up is because this probe had this plaque on it here that had some pictures on it about scientific achievements and people. The people were naked. I've kind of censored this because I don't know what YouTube's going to do with that. But in any case, this plaque was supposed to be if aliens managed to pick this thing up because it's so far away, it would teach them something about us. So what I want you to think for a second is what if you were one of those aliens? What if you picked up this plaque and you saw us on there? What would these 2 pictures of humans tell you about us? Would they tell you anything useful? So I want you to think about that for a second before I give you what I think might be an answer. Do you think that these 2 pictures of people would tell you anything useful about humanity if you were an alien? So I think the answer to it is, yeah, kind of, yes. It would tell you some things about us, right? It would tell you that many people have 2 arms and 2 legs, that we have a head, that there are different types of humans, that we make gestures. So you could learn some things about us from these pictures. However, you might be misled because the reality is most humans don't look like either of these 2 pictures, right? Most humans, there's a huge diversity in the human life that we have on this planet, right? We have people, different backgrounds, different ethnicities. There are taller people, there are shorter people, there are people who are sort of heavier set, slightly different proportions, right? We have males, we have females, and we have other genders as well. Males are not always taller than females. Sometimes females can be taller. The male here appears to be sort of the dominant person where they're waving, but that's not always true. Maybe sometimes the male would be standing in the background and the female would be waving. So in other words, these 2 pictures don't really tell us about that diversity. And in addition, if you look at any one human on the planet, they're unlikely to look that much like either of these 2 people. and also the fact that they're naked, right? I mean, if you think about just yourselves or anybody else, you spend most of your time, most of your day with clothes on. So an alien would not be aware that we wear clothing from these pictures, even though we do most of the time. So the point of this is, what I'm trying to say is, that's kind of true for these cells as well. There really aren't that many cells that look like either of these two cells. So don't think that animal cells look like this, because most of them don't. And some of them don't even have all of these parts, right? That's the joke about the first slide here. This red blood cell here, right? You're so much of a workaholic that you sold your DNA. Red blood cells don't have a nucleus because they leave the extra space to carry oxygen. So yeah, this cell doesn't even have one of these nuclei. So most cells don't look like this. Also, another important thing to know is that these organelles that we list here sort of cleanly, we often give them a very clear definition of what they do, right? So for example, ribosome synthesizes proteins. Mitochondrion, powerhouse of the cell, right? We provide those short, sweet definitions. And that's kind of useful too, because they do tell you something about what these things do. But again, that's simplifying things way too much. Most of these things do a lot of things, and they work together with other organelles to achieve a goal. So if we were to look at our picture of a human here, and we were to look at this arm that's waving, it's not just the arm that's doing that, right? The person's brain is sending a message to their arm. They might be using their shoulder muscles. So there are different aspects of this person working together so that this arm can carry out its function. Same thing's happening here. Okay, so you can think of those as being like our unlearning goals. So I want you to get rid of the idea that cells look like this, and to understand that cells are highly specialized and diverse. They don't look like those pictures. And I want you to understand that the function of an organelle can't be summed up in one sentence. So when you say ribosomes synthesize proteins, yeah, that's a good start, right? That's kind of useful. But don't think that that's just it. Things are usually more complicated than that. And if there's one thing I can teach you in this entire course, it's that biology is messy, and it's usually more complicated than that. So, right, let's continue. Okay, so learning goals here. I want you to be able to explain the concept of biological hierarchy, so we're going to talk about that in a second. Describe and explain the function of organelles in plant and animal cells. I'm mostly going to lead you to that one based on the glossary and the website that I showed you before. Same thing goes for the next one. Identify organelles based on their appearance, and compare and contrast organelles in plant cells, I should say, and also versus animal cells. So I'm going to leave those ones largely with you, but I am going to do a little bit on this one that's not present in the website, that has to do with, again, working against some of these assumptions. I'm going to show you how some of these things work together. Okay, so there are the organelles there. And this is sort of my last warning here. From this point on, I'm going to assume you have some familiarity with these organelles. So what I'm about to tell you in this presentation assumes that you know something about these organelles. Okay. Well, actually, okay. One more thing. You don't necessarily need to know about this for this one slide here. So there's one more slide that you could follow along with. And that's the biological hierarchy. So you have to know that this is the biological hierarchy. We go from organelles to cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, and organisms. These are the smallest things, and these are the largest things. So organisms are bigger than organelles. So these are each levels of organization, and it's hierarchical. One builds on top of the other. And so cells are made of organelles, tissues are made of cells, organs are made of tissues, and so on. Okay? So that's why we call this a hierarchy, because one builds the other. The list can go further in both directions, but we're not going to cover that in this class. We're going to stick between those two bookends if you like. But you might remember from grade 9, you can go past organisms to populations, communities, ecosystems, biomes, and biospheres, if you remember that. And if you know your chemistry, you can go this way as well. You can go to macromolecules, things like DNA and proteins and so on, and then go down to simpler chemicals, molecules, atoms, protons, quarks, right? So you can still go in both directions, but we're going to stick between these. Okay. So here's where you got to know a little bit about organelles to understand what we're going to talk about here. So I want to say something quickly about organelles working together. So what you'll notice what we have here is an electron micrograph of a cell, an animal cell of some kind, and a cleaner picture here that is supposed to help you understand what's going on. So what I want you to take away from this is that these organelles are in very specific order. So you'll notice you have the nucleus, and then we have the endoplasmic reticulum here. It's a rough endoplasmic reticulum because it's got ribosomes on it there. We have these vesicles sort of in between the endoplasmic reticulum and the Golgi apparatus, sometimes called the Golgi body, which is close to the cell membrane. And you can see that same order here, right? We have the nucleus, we have the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and the Golgi body going out towards the edge of the cell. So that's not a coincidence. What's going on here? Well, what's going on is we have something called the endomembrane system. Endo just means inside, right? So membranes inside the cell as opposed to the cell membrane, which divides outside and inside. And so this is important, the endomembrane system, because membranes are used to separate different parts of a cell and to provide different parts of the cell with different environments. So that sounds complicated, but it means something pretty simple. Think about your fridge and your freezer, right? They have a door on them. They're sealed off from the rest of your home. And that's important because you're trying to maintain a different environment inside your fridge and freezer compared to your room, right? You want your fridge and freezer to be cold so your food is preserved. You don't want your room to be cold because you like probably living. So we want different environments because we're trying to do different things in those environments. So same thing sort of going on here. You want to separate things and sometimes have different conditions in one place compared to another so that the cell can do what it needs to do. Okay, so we have stuff going on inside membranes, and that's important because it separates processes in the cell. So what exactly do we have going on here? Well, we said that the rough endoplasmic reticulum has ribosomes on its surface. What do ribosomes do? Well, simple definition you can say is that they synthesize proteins, right? They make proteins. If you want to go a little bit more complicated than that, they don't necessarily make complete proteins. They make incomplete proteins that are modified somewhere else. And one of the places they can be modified is inside the endoplasmic reticulum, which is why the ribosome sits there. Once it creates the unfinished part of the protein, it's sort of kind of threads it, if you like, into the endoplasmic reticulum, and the protein then goes inside there. So what happens there? Well, it can be modified, so it can be kind of finished up a little bit more. The different proteins that are all being produced in there at one time can be sorted so that the cell knows where to put them, and they can move throughout this endomembrane system because it's fairly extensive and it goes through large portions of the cell, so the proteins can actually move through there. Okay, so if you think about it, the ribosome makes the protein, the rough endoplasmic reticulum sorts it and sends the protein in the cell towards where it needs to go. And sometimes this protein is going to need to go outside of the cell to play a role out there. So maybe something like, if you know what insulin is, right? Insulin is a protein made in the body. So it's got to leave the cell so it can go into your blood and help your cells absorb sugar, right? So that protein and others sometimes have to leave the cell. So maybe you've got one of these proteins moving through here that needs to get out. So the next thing that happens is after it gets through the endoplasmic reticulum, it's going to come out of there and go into a little ball called a vesicle. And they look kind of like these things that we have there. So it's just a ball of membrane. If I can show you, where is it here? Yeah, here. So the way a sort of membrane, the way a vesicle kind of pinches off is like this, right? This membrane is fluid, it's flexible, so this will bend. So you can imagine this sort of bending like that. And that's going to be able to pinch. And if you sort of going backwards, right? So this one's going this way, if you like. The other one will be going in reverse, but it sort of can pinch off, and then you have a free floating ball with stuff in it. So the endoplasmic reticulum, this will kind of stick out and come out. And then that ball is going to make its way to the Golgi body. And the way it's going to do that, it's not going to just float there. It's going to travel on the cytoskeleton of the cell. So one way you can understand this cytoskeleton is a little bit like those old Spider-Man movies, if you've ever seen those, where Spider-Man kind of just randomly shoots webs all over the place and they can help him move. So same sort of thing, because these things, these webs or whatever you want to call them, they're constantly appearing and disappearing inside the cell. They're constantly building up and breaking down. And there's sort of these networks of threads appearing and disappearing all over all the time. And what you can have happen is you can have these molecules here called kinesins, which we're not going to worry about. They can pick up a vesicle and kind of walk it along these threads. to move it along the cell. So no, it's not just floating in liquid. That's not what's happening with these things. It's actually being pushed along by these molecules here. So you get your vesicle being pushed along one of those threads, and it gets into the Golgi body. Once it gets there, the vesicle will, just like it can kind of pinch off here, because the membrane's very, very fluid, it can fuse with the Golgi body, and then the protein is released inside. Okay, and that's important because the Golgi body is going to modify the protein to sort of finish it up and prepare it for export, prepare it to leave the cell. And it will do that in another vesicle called the secretory vesicle, which will come off the Golgi apparatus and leave the cell through the cell membrane. Okay, so long story short, these things all work together. Ribosomes produce a protein, which goes into the endoplasmic reticulum. The endoplasmic reticulum sorts and modifies the proteins and sends them towards the outer region of the cell. A vesicle will allow the protein to travel from the endoplasmic reticulum to the Golgi body by way of the cytoskeleton. And then from the Golgi body, the protein is processed, modified, and shipped out through a secretory vessel, which leaves the cell membrane. Okay? So you have a whole bunch of organelles working together. The next example is going to be a little bit shorter. You'll have here in a plant cell, you've got a chloroplast, mitochondrion, and a peroxisome all together in one region of the cell. Again, not a coincidence. These things are related. So you might know that chloroplasts do photosynthesis, right? They take in carbon dioxide and water. The sunlight provides the source of energy, which you'll sometimes see written above this arrow here. And they produce oxygen and sugar. So this is how a plant produces sugar, right? What uses sugar? Well, the mitochondria will use sugar as part of the cellular respiration process. It's a little bit more complicated than this is letting on, but the mitochondria is going to be using oxygen plus material that comes from that sugar to make carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So if you're a plant cell and you want to create little bundles of energy that things in your cell can use, things like, these molecules walking the vesicles along, things like your ribosomes, which need energy to make protein. If you want to make little sort of packages of energy called ATP that support that, then what you need to do is take the sunlight and the carbon dioxide and water, make your sugar, then take the sugar and use oxygen to break it down, and that's how you get these little packets of energy, right? The mitochondria plays a very important role there. So you can see why those two things would be paired together, right? This provides the sugar, and this breaks the sugar apart and takes the energy from it and provides it out in little packages that can be used in the cell. So what's the peroxisome doing here? Well, what the peroxisome does is, among other things, is it breaks down hydrogen peroxide. Because like we said, biology is messy. These equations look really nice and neat and simple, right? Respiration down here, photosynthesis up here. They're just opposites of each other. That's not true. If you take grade 12 biology, you're going to learn that these things are fairly complicated. And it's also possible that hydrogen peroxide can be produced as a byproduct of this. And peroxide is bad. It's dangerous. So we need to take care of that if the cell is going to survive. Right? That's why you might put hydrogen peroxide on an injury. It can kill any bacteria that get in there because it's toxic to cells. But the peroxisome has an enzyme called catalase within it that can basically just take peroxide and convert it to water and oxygen, make it pretty harmless. So you can see why that would be next to the mitochondrion if this thing is producing hydrogen peroxide. Incidentally, if you're wondering, when you put hydrogen peroxide on a cut, when it bubbles like this, you might think, oh, well, that's because it's working, it's reacting with the bacteria or something like that. But it's actually the same enzyme, catalase, that's actually breaking it apart. It's turning it into water and oxygen, and that's actually what you're seeing happen here. Okay, so that's all I really wanted to say here. Make sure that you go to this website and fill out your glossary from biological hierarchy up to cytoskeleton. Complete all those words. Again, write them in your own words because it's more important that you understand rather than just copy. There is going to be a quiz on this at the end of the unit. Okay, and the last thing to mention here is make sure that you understand these two key points, right? Make sure you understand that cells are specialized. They don't necessarily look like either of these two cells, and that the organelles have relatively complex functions and they help each other carry out the goals of a cell. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you.